The rain at Fort Liberty did not fall. It slammed the way orders slam through the air in a barracks when someone forgets their salute. I sat on the narrow cot with my left leg locked in a brace that gleamed under the flicker of fluorescent light. The air smelled like metal antiseptic and control. 2 weeks earlier, my stepfather had broken my leg and told everyone it was an accident during a training demonstration. Now he said I was safer if I stayed inside the female barracks under medical recovery orders. Safer meant silent. Safer meant unseen. I remember how he smiled when he handed Captain Mendez the form that kept me here. Mendez signed without hesitation. I saw the ink bleed through the paper like it was sealing something darker. Outside, thunder rolled across the base and the flag flapped wet against the pole. Inside, time stretched until it felt like a punishment I had earned simply for breathing too loudly. I am First Lieutenant Rowan Pierce, Army Nurse Corps, 25 years old, stationed at Fort Liberty, North Carolina. The rank on my chest should have meant authority. Tonight it meant nothing. My stepfather, Dale Riker, was once a drill instructor. He still walked like he owned every floor his boots touched. The door opened without a knock. He stood in the frame, his retired uniform jacket zipped halfway, his old ID swinging from a lanyard. "You should thank me, Lieutenant," he said. "I am keeping you out of trouble." His tone carried that false kindness soldiers hear before a storm. I watched the rain dripping from his shoulders onto the floor tiles, each drop hitting with precision. He sat on the chair across from me and leaned forward. "You never learned when to stop questioning. That is what breaks people." I said nothing. My phone was hidden beneath the pillow, the screen dark but recording. I could feel the vibration of the microphone against my fingertips. He stared at the brace on my leg and chuckled. "You heal people for a living, yet you cannot fix yourself." I met his eyes. That was the first time in years I did not look away. The hum of the ceiling light seemed to grow louder, matching the pulse in my ears. He called it protection. I called it prison. I wanted to tell him that I knew what protection should feel like. It should feel like trust, not isolation, but my voice refused to obey. He glanced at the window. The floodlight from outside cast his shadow over my bed, stretching until it covered me completely. He liked that. He stood and adjusted his jacket. "Remember, Rowan, you owe me for everything. You are here because I pulled strings. Without me, you would be discharged before sunrise." Then he left the door clicking softly behind him. The silence afterward was heavy enough to crush a heartbeat. I reached for my phone and stopped the recording. His words were there, captured in digital clarity. My fingers trembled, not from fear, but from calculation. Every threat had rhythm, and I was beginning to hear his. I leaned back against the cold wall and listened to the rain. Each drop outside hit the tin roof like a count towards something inevitable. The camera in the corner blinked red, its lens reflecting a faint pulse of light. I wondered how many eyes had looked through it and chosen to do nothing. My reflection in the window looked pale and unrecognizable, a woman who had worn composure so long it became another kind of armor. I remembered my father, not Dale, but the man who had taught me how to read pulse rates by feel and said, "Calm hands save lives." My hands were calm now, too calm. A strange peace spread through me, the kind that comes before a decision you cannot take back. I whispered to the empty room, just loud enough for the recording to catch. "You thought you locked me in Dale. You never learned I was watching the locks." The rain outside slowed to a steady rhythm. Somewhere, a bugle sounded faintly through the speakers, marking midnight. The bass slept. I did not. I looked at the medical order pinned to the door, his signature beneath Captain Mendez's. The ink had dried crooked. I pressed my thumb against it and felt nothing. This paper said I was confined for my safety, but it felt more like evidence waiting for the right witness. The lamp above flickered again, a brief blackout, then light returned. I stared at the door handle, half expecting it to turn again. When it did not, I whispered one more line for myself, not for the recorder. "The next time he walks in, I will already be free." Outside, the flag shifted in the wind, heavy with rain, a shape that refused to fall. The sound of thunder rolled again closer now, echoing through the steel beams. The room felt smaller, but my resolve filled it. Fear had done its worst. I was still here. I inhaled slowly, let the air settle in my chest, and closed my eyes for one steady moment. The walls could keep me inside, but they could not keep what I knew from growing. Have you ever been trapped by someone who swore they were protecting you? Tell me what you would have done. I grew up 20 minutes outside Fort Liberty back when it was still called Fort Bragg. My world smelled of cut grass, motor oil, and a kind of silence that waited for footsteps. My father died when I was 8, a training accident on the range. They folded the flag, handed it to my mother, and told her his sacrifice would be remembered. By the next summer, his name faded from the mailbox from her voice. That was the year Dale Riker arrived. He wore his uniform like a sermon and spoke in orders even when he was asking for the salt. I remember his boots beside the door, polished so sharp they reflected my face when I bent to tie my shoes. He used to say discipline builds character. At first, it sounded noble. Then I learned it meant standing in the hallway until my knees shook because I forgot to make the bed tight enough to bounce a coin. He never shouted in public. He saved his lessons for when the curtains were drawn. My mother Elaine would whisper later that he just wanted me strong. Strength was her prayer for everything she could not control. When she smiled, it looked like she was apologizing for existing. By the time I turned 12, I stopped crying. Tears only gave him a reason to start over. I counted seconds like a metronome until the house went quiet again. My room became my barracks before I ever saw one. The walls were pale yellow, the paint bubbling from humidity, the kind of color that pretends to be warm but never is. I kept a notebook under the bed filled with plans. Every time he made me stand straighter, I drew maps of escape routes, roads leading to anywhere that wasn't him. When I was 16, I started running before sunrise. I told my mother it was for track practice, but really it was to feel what air tasted like before the house woke up. The town of Fayetteville looked different in those hours. The streetlights hummed, and the base sirens in the distance sounded less like warnings and more like promises. I passed the Army hospital fence line each morning, watching nurses in scrubs carrying coffee cups toward the main entrance. I wanted that kind of purpose, the kind that didn't require permission. Dale saw the recruitment pamphlet on my desk when I was 17. He laughed. "You'll never make it through basic," he said. "You talk too soft. You think too much." Then he added almost kindly that I should be grateful someone like him bothered to teach me about discipline. That night, I looked in the mirror and decided gratitude was overrated. I applied to the Army Nurse Corps and left home the week after graduation. My mother cried at the bus station. Dale shook my hand like I was a soldier already. His grip was firm enough to bruise. Basic at Fort Sam Houston felt easier than living under his roof. When drill sergeants yelled, I didn't flinch. I had already learned that tone. I learned to move quickly, think clearly, and hide exhaustion behind posture. For the first time, the structure made sense. The rules were the same for everyone. Effort had results instead of punishments. The Army didn't ask me to shrink. It asked me to perform. By 22, I had my commission. My uniform fit the way dignity should fit, not tight, not loud, just right. I wrote my mother once a month. Sometimes she wrote back. The letters always ended the same way Dale says hello. I never answered that part. Years passed in predictable cycles, deployments, rotations, training sessions, 12-hour shifts in hospitals that smelled of bleach and resolve. I learned to fix what could be fixed and let go of what couldn't. But life has a way of folding back on itself. When my mother called 3 years ago, her voice sounded smaller. She said Dale had retired and they were living on his pension. She said she missed me. Then she said she needed help. I took leave and drove home the same road lined with pine trees and broken mailboxes. The house looked smaller, the yard untended. Dale opened the door before I knocked. His smile was polite, but his eyes were still the same cold calculation behind courtesy. My mother's health had declined. The hospital bills stacked like unread letters. I covered 1 month of treatment, then another. I told myself it was duty, not obligation. When I left, he shook my hand again, same pressure, same bruising reminder. I thought that was the end of it until he showed up on base 8 months later, claiming he was consulting on a behavioral program for returning veterans. He wasn't listed anywhere in the system, but he had a badge and the confidence of someone who knew how to slip through cracks. The first time I saw him walking the hallway of the medical wing, my pulse spiked like I'd been ambushed. He told me he was proud of me. He called me lieutenant in front of others as if we were a family worth admiring. I wanted to believe it was harmless until the invoices started arriving at my apartment equipment orders I never placed signed with my name. I traced the trail to a Shell account linked to his consulting ID. When I confronted him, he smiled the same way he always had and said, "You should be more careful with your passwords." That night, I reported the incident to Captain Mendez, who promised to investigate. Nothing happened. A week later, Dale found me outside the infirmary and leaned close enough for only me to hear. "You need to learn loyalty," he said. The following month, my mother called in tears. He'd lost his temper. She begged me not to tell anyone. She said he was under stress. I heard the crash of glass in the background before the call dropped. I drove through the night and found her with bruises she refused to explain. He was sitting on the porch drinking coffee calm as a statue. He looked at me and said, "You think your rank scares me." Then he smiled and told me to go home. I should have walked away. I didn't. That night was the last time I saw my leg whole. He said it was an accident. That was the first lie. He said the stairs were wet. That was the second. The truth came between the cracks of memory like light under a locked door. I remember the sound before the pain, the way the wooden steps snapped under pressure, his hand gripping my arm too tightly as if helping and then letting go. Gravity did the rest. When I opened my eyes, my leg was twisted in a direction no leg should ever go. He stood at the bottom of the stairs, breathing hard expression unreadable. Then he said, "You slipped." The smell of spilled coffee filled the air, bitter and warm. My mother's voice trembled behind him, but she said nothing. At the hospital, he told the nurse he had been carrying groceries when I fell. He said he had tried to catch me. She wrote his words down carefully because that is what nurses do. I watched the pen move, wanting to speak, but the morphine dulled everything except the memory of his hand leaving my arm. My mother sat in the corner, twisting her wedding ring. Every time I tried to meet her eyes, she looked away. When the doctor explained the break, Dale asked the questions. He wanted to know recovery time, physical therapy schedule, and when I could return to duty. The doctor said 8 to 10 weeks if I followed medical orders. Dale nodded and said, "She's a fighter. She'll be fine." His tone was calm, professional, almost proud. That night, I heard him outside my hospital room speaking to someone over the phone, his voice low and firm. "She'll stay on base," he said. "It's safer there." The next morning, Captain Mendez came to see me. He carried a clipboard and a look that felt rehearsed. "Lieutenant Pierce, he said you'll be placed under medical recovery orders. We'll arrange quarters for you in the female barracks. Your stepfather has volunteered to help oversee your physical therapy. He has clearance from his previous service. It will be temporary." I tried to protest, but my throat closed on the words. Mendez smiled without warmth. "You need rest, ma'am. Let us take care of you." By the time I was discharged from the hospital, everything was already arranged. My belongings had been moved to a small barracks room near the old medical wing. My phone and laptop were missing. Dale met me at the entrance with a clipboard of his own. "Sign here," he said. "Just confirmation of your transfer." His handwriting filled the lines below mine, his signature bold, confident. He walked beside me through the hallway, nodding to soldiers who still called him Sergeant. He wasn't supposed to have that kind of access anymore, but no one questioned it. He knew how to wear authority like armor. The first week passed in a blur of medication and silence. He brought meals, adjusted my brace, and told me when to rest. I wanted to believe the care was real until he started locking the door from the outside. "Base security," he said when I asked. "You're not supposed to move around without supervision." I tested the handle one night after he left. It didn't turn. The following morning, he found me at the window and smiled. "You still don't follow orders," he said. "That's what gets people hurt." Every day, he spoke about discipline and gratitude. Every night, I replayed the fall in my mind frame by frame, trying to find where it changed from clumsiness to intent. The line blurred, but his eyes at the bottom of the stairs stayed clear. There was no shock in them, no fear, just calculation. That was how he always looked before a punishment. My mother called once, her voice small over the line. "He says you're healing well," she whispered. "I hope you're not angry with him. He's under pressure." I wanted to scream, to ask her if she ever wondered why pressure only seemed to break other people. Instead, I said I was fine. She sighed, relieved. "Good girl," she said. "You've always been so strong." That phrase used to feel like praise. Now it felt like surrender. Strength, I realized, was the word people used when they wanted you to endure what they could not. The day before everything began to change, Dale came in carrying a file folder. He said he was helping Captain Mendez process my reclassification to non-active status during recovery. Inside were pages of forms, each already filled out. My signature was the only blank space. He placed the pen in my hand. "Just sign where it says Lieutenant Pierce." His voice was even patient, the way you speak to someone you already own. I signed. I shouldn't have. That night, I couldn't sleep. The base was quiet except for the steady hum of generators outside. The pain in my leg pulsed with my heartbeat, a rhythm I couldn't ignore. I stared at the ceiling and thought about the nurse at the hospital who had believed him about Captain Mendez and his easy smile about my mother's silence. The realization crept over me like a slow frost. This wasn't recovery. It was containment. When I tried to open the door again, it moved an inch, then stopped. Metal met metal. I pressed my forehead against the cold frame and whispered, "He called it protection. I call it what it is." The camera light blinked red in the corner, recording my stillness. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not rage exactly, something sharper. Clarity. If he wanted me silent, he would have to learn what silence can do when it listens long enough. The next morning, he brought coffee and told me we'd begin new exercises soon. I smiled. My hand brushed the small recorder hidden in the pocket of my brace. It was already running. He didn't notice. He never imagined I could turn his own lessons back on him. People like Dale never do. Morning at Fort Liberty began like every other, the bugle echoing across the base while the world outside my window came to attention. Inside the barracks, time stood still. My brace clinked softly against the metal bed frame each time I shifted. The sound had become a clock I didn't ask for. Dale appeared at 0700 carrying a clipboard and a cup of coffee that smelled too strong to be kind. He set both on the desk and watched me the way an instructor watches a recruit waiting to fail. "You'll start walking with one crutch today," he said. Slowly. "You're still under medical observation." He made it sound official. Everything he did sounded official. That was how he built his control, not through force anymore, but through the rhythm of procedure. Every order came wrapped in the language of care. Every restriction was disguised as protection. It's how manipulation hides in plain sight. It borrows the words of authority and empties them of meaning. He logged my vitals with the precision of someone who had done this before. I knew the routine because it used to be mine. "You're improving," he said, marking a note. "But progress requires obedience. You understand that, right?" I nodded. The nod cost nothing, but it bought silence. When he left, I stared at the coffee cup. His fingerprints fogged the rim. I poured the contents down the drain and watched the brown swirl vanish into the steel. My reflection in the liquid bent and disappeared. That was the first time I realized how easy it was for someone like him to rewrite the truth. The world believed whatever he poured into it. Days blurred into a schedule that looked legitimate on paper. Physical therapy in the morning, rest in the afternoon, observation at night. I was allowed outside once a day, escorted by him 10 minutes under the excuse of light mobility training. He always walked one step behind me, his shadow spilling over mine. To anyone passing by, it looked like supervision. To me, it was surveillance. He kept my phone on his desk, face down. "Too much screen time delays healing," he'd said. I didn't argue. Arguing had a cost I could no longer afford. Instead, I listened to the way his keys jingled when he locked the door, to the way the overhead vent clicked when the air conditioning kicked in, to the shift in his breathing when he lied. In an environment built on order, the smallest inconsistencies become clues. By the second week, I knew the exact moment the security patrol passed outside. I counted the steps between their radio chatter fading and the silence that followed. Those were my seconds of freedom. I used them to hide a small micro recorder inside the hollow section of my brace. Every night when Dale left, I whispered into it everything I remembered from the day. The tone of his voice. The way he said my name. The phrases he used to disguise control for your safety as your guardian. It's just protocol. If manipulation had a language that was its vocabulary. Sometimes he brought my mother's voice with him. He'd play recordings of her messages on speaker, each one a careful mix of guilt and affection. "He says you're doing better, Rowan. I'm proud of you." I'd listen in silence while he watched for my reaction. He wanted me to feel tethered, to remember that even outside these walls his reach still existed. I learned to keep my face calm, a surface smooth enough to mirror his delusion back at him. One night, during an inspection, he noticed the vent above my bed had been unscrewed slightly. He ran a finger across the metal and smiled. "Curious thing about soldiers," he said. "You give them walls, they look for cracks." He leaned close, his breath steady. "But remember, Lieutenant Curiosity killed more careers than disobedience ever did." He turned the screw tight again. The sound of metal grinding against metal felt like the door of a cell closing. When he left, I exhaled so hard, the air burned my throat. I started keeping a mental log of his routines: 0630 arrival, 1900 check-in, 2200 final inspection. He left at 2230, sharp keys jingling, door locked. The pattern never changed. Patterns are a kind of weakness when someone believes they control the chaos. On the 10th night, the base electricity flickered from the storm outside. For 10 seconds, the security cameras blinked off. 10 seconds of darkness, 10 seconds of opportunity. I used the handle of my crutch to reach the power socket under the desk and pulled out the small plug that connected his laptop to the wall. The screen died with a soft click. When the lights returned, he wouldn't notice until morning. That laptop contained every medical order, every document he used to justify my confinement. I needed a copy before he realized how fragile his empire was. I took out the micro SD card I'd hidden in the lining of my brace and slipped it under the keyboard. The plan wasn't finished, but the first move was made. The next morning, he noticed nothing. Control makes people careless. He handed me a folder marked Progress Report and said, "Captain Mendez wants updates." I watched his hands as he spoke, steady, confident, belonging to a man who thought every outcome had already been decided. He didn't know I had started deciding things too. That night, when he checked the door, I caught a reflection of myself in the window. The woman staring back wasn't broken. She was waiting. The third week began with fog rolling low across the parade ground, a gray curtain that muffled the morning bugle. Inside my room, the air felt thicker, as if the walls had learned to breathe with me. Dale brought breakfast and news in the same voice. "Mendez signed off on your extended confinement," he said, placing the tray on the desk. "He agrees that structure will help your recovery." I nodded while every muscle in my leg tightened beneath the brace. The word structure had become another name for captivity. When he left for his daily briefing, I waited for the echo of his boots to fade. The corridor went silent. I pulled the laptop cord from under the desk, connected my hidden drive, and began copying the folder marked Medical Compliance Logs. My fingers shook, but my breathing stayed even. Years in the nurse course had taught me that calm hands save lives. Sometimes they save your own. The progress bar crawled across the screen while the hum of the vent filled the room. 10%, 2040. I whispered the numbers under my breath like a prayer. At 60%, the doorknob turned. I yanked the drive free and slid it under the mattress just as he stepped inside. He glanced at the laptop. Working hard today, I forced a smile. Reviewing my chart, trying to understand the treatment plan. He studied me, suspicion flickering across his face before pride replaced it. "That's my girl," he said, tapping the screen. Always the overachiever. He picked up the coffee mug from the desk, took a sip, and walked out. The door clicked shut again. I exhaled, every muscle trembling. The file transfer was incomplete, but enough data had been copied to prove he'd altered the logs. The document timestamps showed edits that didn't align with my hospital release date. Evidence doesn't need to shout. It just needs to exist. That night, the rain returned. It struck the roof like restless fingers. I lay awake, staring at the blinking red light of the security camera. The idea came slowly, like a whisper I almost didn't trust. The camera didn't just record, it transmitted. If I could reroute the feed, someone outside might finally see what was happening. I waited until after 2200 when his footsteps moved down the corridor toward the exit. I counted to 100, then lifted the panel on the back wall that covered the maintenance port. Inside, a cluster of wires glowed faintly. My training in medical equipment maintenance had included basic data routing. It was enough. I connected a small cable I'd hidden in my brace to the feed line and redirected it to the infirmary's internal channel. If it worked, the next inspection livestream would show more than patient recovery. It would show the truth. The next morning, he noticed the camera had a static flicker. "Technical issue," I said. "Happens when the humidity's high." He grunted, unconcerned. "Arrogance is the quietest accomplice to justice." The bass followed its rhythm. Outside, drills thundered across the parade ground. Inside, I rehearsed my escape not through force, but through exposure. I didn't need to fight him physically. I just needed to let the world watch. He began spending longer hours in the office that week, planning what he called my extended care. I overheard him on the phone saying, "She's dependent now. She'll come around." My pulse slowed instead of spiking. Dependence was his illusion. I was already gone in every way that mattered. On Friday evening, he arrived early. His jacket was pressed, his ID still hanging like a medal of authority. "Inspection tonight," he said. "Mendez wants an update video. They'll stream it to the medical board for evaluation." I looked at the blinking light of the camera and almost smiled. "Good," I said. "Let's give them something to see." He didn't hear the meaning beneath my tone. He adjusted the camera angle, making sure I was centered in the frame. Then he stood behind me, one hand on the back of the chair, too close as always. "Smile for the board," he said. The lens caught everything, the tension in my shoulders, the edge in his smirk. He started dictating my progress notes aloud. "Patient shows signs of improvement," he said, his voice professional, detached. I waited until his next sentence, then spoke over him. "Correction," I said clearly. "Patient remains confined without authorization under falsified orders." He froze. "What did you just say?" "The feed is live," I replied softly. "They're watching." He turned toward the camera eyes, wide realization dawning too late. His hand shot toward the power cord, but before he could reach it, the door opened. 2 MPs stepped inside, led by Lieutenant Mason Cruz. Their radios crackled. "We received a signal from this room," Mason said. Dale's mouth opened-closed. "She's unstable," he snapped. "She needs supervision." Mason looked at me. "Lieutenant, are you all right?" I nodded once. "I have everything recorded. The files, the orders, the video." My voice was steady. "Calm hands." Dale lunged toward the laptop. The MPs intercepted him, pushing him back against the wall. "You'll regret this," he hissed. I met his glare. "I already did. Now it's your turn." The officers led him out while Mason shut the door. For the first time in weeks, I heard a sound I hadn't heard before, silence that didn't belong to him. I sat on the bed and felt the weight in my chest shift. The fear didn't vanish, but it changed shape. It became distance. I could finally breathe without permission. Outside, thunder rolled again, softer this time, like applause heard from far away. The day after they took Dale away, the bass seemed louder. Every sound carried purpose again. The cadence of morning drills, the distant whir of helicopters, even the click of my crutch against the linoleum hallway. Freedom, I learned, doesn't arrive with a fanfare. It creeps in quietly disguised as ordinary noise. I was escorted to the infirmary for evaluation, still under recovery status, but no longer under his control. Lieutenant Mason Cruz waited there, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, uniform immaculate. When he saw me, his expression softened. "You're tougher than anyone knew," he said. I tried to smile, but my voice came out hoarse. "I didn't want to be tough. I just wanted to be believed." He nodded. "Now you will be." They moved me into a private room at Womack Army Medical Center. The window overlooked the training fields. From here, I could see soldiers running drills in perfect formation, the kind of symmetry that used to calm me. Mason visited every evening under the pretense of checking my vitals. In reality, he was helping me piece together what had happened. He'd been the one who noticed the irregular security feed, the one who convinced the MPs to investigate when the signal came through. "You timed it perfectly," he said. I shook my head. "I was lucky." He smiled faintly. "Luck favors preparation." Over the next week, we gathered evidence. Mason accessed the server logs to trace the camera rerouting I had initiated. The digital signature confirmed that the feed had indeed broadcast live to the inspection board. He also retrieved the data from my brace's micro recorder. We listened together, his expression tightening as Dale's voice filled the room, orders wrapped in control affection laced with threat. He built his lies like blueprints, Mason said quietly. All neat lines and no mercy. My case reached Major Dana Whitaker, the commanding officer of the medical wing. She arrived unannounced one afternoon, a tall woman with calm eyes and the kind of authority that didn't need to raise its voice. She closed the door behind her and studied me for a long moment. "Lieutenant Pierce," she said, "finally, I read your report. I also read the gaps in it." I met her gaze. Gaps. She set the file on the table. "You left out what happened at the house before the injury." My throat tightened. "It wouldn't change the facts." She nodded slowly. "Maybe not for the court, but it changes the story you tell yourself." I didn't respond. She continued. "When I was a cadet, my superior officer used to call me his project. Said I'd never make rank without his guidance. Took me years to understand that some forms of control wear uniforms too. You're not the first to mistake discipline for protection." Her words settled heavy in the air. "You have something many people never get, Lieutenant," she said softly. "Proof. Don't waste it on anger. Use it for change." That night I couldn't sleep. Her words replayed with the rhythm of the monitors beside my bed. Proof wasn't revenge. It was responsibility. I began compiling everything into a single encrypted file: videos, audio, falsified orders, every detail that had kept me confined. Mason stayed late, helping me cross-check timestamps. When we finished, the file was over 200 pages. "You sure you want this to go through official channels?" he asked. "It could get messy." I met his eyes. It already was. He handed me a flash drive labeled Phoenix. "For your rebirth," he said with a half-smile. The next morning, Major Whitaker called me into her office. The blinds were drawn sunlight leaking through in narrow strips. She gestured to a chair. "We're forwarding your file to the Inspector General's office," she said. "There will be hearings, reviews, maybe disciplinary actions. But before that, I want you to know something." She leaned forward, voice steady. "You didn't survive because you were lucky or trained. You survived because you refused to forget your own credibility." The words hit deeper than any metal could. I nodded, unable to speak. She stood extending her hand. "We'll take it from here, Lieutenant. Rest for now. The system will move slowly, but it will move." When I left her office, the corridor smelled faintly of antiseptic and rain carried in from someone's boots. I thought of all the days those smells meant fear. Today, they smelled like closure beginning to form. Outside, the clouds over Fort Liberty were breaking apart, thin light spilling through like a promise. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel the weight of confinement. I felt the pull of forward motion. The investigation didn't unfold in a single burst. It came like a tide, slow, deliberate, impossible to stop once it gathered weight. Within a week, the Inspector General's office requested official statements. Major Whitaker sat beside me during the debrief, her uniform sharp, her presence steady. The investigator read from the report, voice clipped and sterile. "Lieutenant Pierce, can you confirm that Captain Mendez authorized confinement under medical recovery orders dated June 17th? I nodded. "Yes, sir." He signed the document without verifying my medical clearance. "And who presented that order to him?" "Dale Riker." I said the words clean and heavy. "Retired drill instructor. No active clearance." The investigator's pen paused mid-stroke. The sound of ink scratching paper returned a second later. When it ended, Major Whitaker escorted me out into the corridor. She said nothing until we reached the stairwell. "You handled that with discipline," she said quietly. "Not everyone can keep composure under that kind of scrutiny." I answered the only way I could. "Years of practice." She almost smiled. "It shows." Outside, Mason waited by the railing with 2 coffees. He handed me one. "You looked calm enough to scare them," he said. "That's a compliment." I took a sip. It was bitter but grounding. "They're going after Mendez next," he added. "Turns out his signature appears on 3 other recovery orders that don't match protocol." I stared at the horizon beyond the base gates. So this wasn't just me. "No," he said, but you were the one who broke the pattern." The following days blurred into interviews and briefings. I spent hours in conference rooms lit by fluorescent hums replaying the same facts until the truth sounded mechanical. Each repetition dulled the fear a little more. Mendez was suspended pending investigation. Dale remained in civilian custody awaiting trial. The system that once ignored me was finally listening, not because I shouted louder, but because the evidence spoke for itself. Proof, as Major Whitaker had said, had a tone that silenced excuses. One afternoon, I found Mason in the records office surrounded by stacks of files. He looked up dark circles under his eyes. "You're not supposed to be walking around without clearance," he said. I leaned on my crutch. "You're not supposed to be working past shift change." He smiled. Fair point. He handed me a folder. Inside was a photo of Captain Mendez shaking hands with Dale outside the security building 2 months before my confinement. The timestamp matched the week my recovery order was issued. "He vouched for him," Mason said. "That's how Dale got base access." I traced the edges of the photo, feeling the faint imprint of the paper. "Why, I asked." "Favor trading," Mason said. "Mendez owed him. Old boys network stuff. You know how it works." The anger that rose wasn't loud. It was cold and precise. "Then it ends here," I said. Mason nodded. "Whitaker's already moving. She's got the photo, the logs, everything." That night, Major Whitaker called a closed meeting in her office. Only 3 of us attended. She stood by the window, arms crossed. "The Inspector General will file formal charges against Mendez," she said. "Misuse of authority, falsification of documents, and negligence leading to unlawful confinement." She looked at me. "They'll also recommend a commendation for your conduct." "I know that's not what you were after, but it's coming." I shook my head. "I don't need a medal, ma'am. I need this to mean something." Her gaze softened. "Then make it mean something. Help us rebuild the policy so no one else disappears behind paperwork again." The offer landed with quiet gravity. I thought of the barracks, the locked door, the smell of metal and silence. "I'll do it," I said. "I know exactly how it starts." After the meeting, Mason walked me to the courtyard. The air smelled of wet pine and diesel. "You realize he said you just turned your trauma report into reform policy." I smiled faintly. "Better use for it than therapy notes." He laughed softly, the first real laugh I'd heard in months. As we stood there, a convoy rolled past toward the main gate. Soldiers saluted, unaware of the small revolution taking shape inside their own walls. I thought of how easily abuse hides behind the language of order and how rare it is for light to reach those corners. "He thought silence would keep me obedient," I said quietly. Mason glanced at me. "And now I said silence belongs to me. I decide when it ends." The next morning, an email arrived from Major Whitaker's Office Policy Review Committee. Safe Barracks Initiative Lead Advisor, Lieutenant Rowan Pierce. I read it twice before it felt real. The weight that had followed me since the fall eased just enough for air to move again. Outside, the flag caught the morning wind snapping once sharp and clear. Justice, I discovered, doesn't end when the paperwork is filed. It lingers heavy and unfinished, waiting to see who survives the silence that follows. Weeks after Mendez's suspension, the investigation spread wider than anyone expected. What started as one forged order exposed a pattern that reached through layers of command. People stopped meeting my eyes in hallways. Conversations ended when I entered a room. Whispers carried my name in fragments. "Lieutenant Pierce, that's the one from the case, the nurse who recorded everything." Some looked at me with respect, others with caution, a few with irritation, as if my existence had made their world inconvenient. Major Whitaker called me in early one morning. Her office smelled like rain-soaked paper and coffee left too long on a burner. "You're being transferred to temporary administrative duty," she said, "away from direct patient care until the review board concludes." I understood the reason optics procedure, the military's instinct to isolate the disruption, but it still felt like confinement wearing a new badge. She studied me carefully. "This isn't punishment," she said. "It's protection." I almost smiled at the irony. "I've heard that word before," I replied. Mason found me later in the cafeteria, sitting at the far table by the window. "You knew this was coming," he said. "They don't like internal noise." "I'm not noise," I said quietly. "I'm proof." He nodded. That's why you scare them. The next few days passed in the gray blur of paperwork and waiting. My crutch leaned against the wall like an unwanted reminder. The leg had healed enough for walking, but the ache returned in the evenings dull and steady like the echo of his hand. Sometimes I caught myself staring at the brace marks on my skin, wondering how long scars remember the weight of what caused them. On a Friday afternoon, I received a call from the Fayetteville Police Department. The officer's tone was measured careful. "Ma'am, this is regarding the civilian case of Dale Riker. There's been a development." My pulse jumped, steadying only through habit. What kind of development? "He posted bail this morning," the officer said. "Released under supervision until trial." The line went quiet, except for the hum of air conditioning. "Thank you for letting me know I managed. If he contacts you, call us immediately," the officer added. I hung up and stared at the phone for a long time. Freedom, I thought, had a different meaning for men like him. That evening, the base seemed to vibrate with tension I couldn't name. Storm clouds stacked low, pressing against the horizon. I walked the perimeter path alone, the limp still noticeable. Each step felt like a question. What would I do if he showed up again? The rational part of me knew. Security was tighter now that I wasn't the same woman who once waited behind locked doors. But fear isn't rational. It's memory with a heartbeat. I reached the edge of the parade ground and stopped. Across the field, headlights flashed near the visitor checkpoint. A figure in a dark jacket argued with the guard. My breath caught until I saw the guard shake his head and close the gate. The car turned around, taillights disappearing into the dusk. I stood there until the last trace of red faded. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it wasn't. When I returned to my quarters, a small envelope waited under the door. No name, no address, just my rank written in uneven ink. Inside was a single photo Dale in a civilian coat standing outside the courthouse looking straight into the camera. On the back, a line written in his precise handwriting. "We're not done." The air seemed to shrink around me. I locked the door, my mind replaying every protocol I'd ever taught about reporting threats. Then I stopped. The system would record it, file it, maybe act, maybe not. But this wasn't just about protection anymore. It was about closure. I called Mason. He arrived within 10 minutes, breath visible in the cold. "He's taunting you," he said, examining the photo. "He wants a reaction." "He'll get one," I said, "but not the one he expects." We met with Major Whitaker that night. She listened without interruption, then leaned back in her chair. "He's testing boundaries," she said. "Let him. The more he moves, the easier it is to catch him crossing the line." Her eyes sharpened. "You're safe here, Lieutenant. But I won't insult you by pretending you should feel safe." The next week blurred with small tasks, interviews, documentation, physical therapy sessions I no longer needed, but attended anyway to fill the hours. One afternoon, Mason entered the therapy room carrying a sealed folder. "From the IG office," he said. "They finalized the internal report." I opened it expecting satisfaction, but the words read like autopsy notes, clinical detached, stripped of the weight they carried. Mendez reprimanded pending discharge. Dale's actions categorized as civilian misconduct. No mention of the weeks I spent behind that locked door. No mention of the silence it took to survive. I closed the folder slowly. They reduced everything to bullet points. Mason rested a hand on the table. "That's what systems do. But people remember stories, not reports. You're not finished yet." That night, a storm swept through Fort Liberty. Power flickered, lights stuttered. I stood by the window watching the rain blur the world outside. The brace still rested in the corner polished metal, catching faint light. I thought of the phrase Dale used the night before he fell from control. "You'll regret this." He was wrong. Regret was his burden now. Mine was remembering. The next morning, Major Whitaker called me to her office again. "The board approved your initiative proposal," she said. "Safe barracks. We'll start drafting new confinement protocols immediately." I stared at her, momentarily speechless. "You want me to lead it?" "Who better?" she said. "You lived every flaw in the current system. Fix it." Something in my chest unclenched. Purpose moved in to replace fear. "I'll do it," I said. Not as a survivor, as a soldier. Later, as I walked out of the building, Mason waited by the steps. "You heard," he asked. "I heard. Then let's get to work." We stood for a moment, watching sunlight break through the clouds. The air smelled of rain and metal, the same scent that once meant captivity, but now carried something cleaner. Freedom finally uncorrupted. I turned toward the horizon where the parade field stretched wide and empty. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like a patient or a victim or a case file. I felt like an officer again, standing on ground I had reclaimed. The storm had passed, but the thunder still echoed in the distance like a reminder that peace is not the absence of noise. It's learning which sounds no longer control you. The day began too quietly, the kind of quiet that feels deliberate, like the world was holding its breath before a storm. I woke to the sound of distant thunder rolling over Fort Liberty and the faint metallic tap of rain against the window. My uniform lay folded on the chair by the bed, name tag polished insignia straight. Today wasn't about recovery anymore. It was inspection day, Major Whitaker's first full review of the new Safe Barracks procedures. The security team had set up a live video feed for transparency streaming directly to the medical command's internal servers. Every inspection, every interaction, every protocol demonstration would be recorded for review. It was the perfect stage for truth to exist without me having to say another word. I arrived early at the ward where the demonstration was scheduled. The hallways gleamed under fluorescent light, sterile and cold. Mason waited near the nurse's station, tablet in hand. "The system's live," he said quietly. "Command's already watching." I nodded, adjusting my sleeve. "Let's make sure they see what's real." The room smelled of antiseptic and coffee gone bitter. I checked the monitors, calibrated the cameras, and reviewed the medical chart displayed on the screen. Everything was ready, routine controlled. For the first time, I felt like I was standing on the other side of fear. Then a voice behind me said my name. Soft, familiar, poisonous. "Rowan." I froze. The voice didn't belong here. When I turned, Dale stood in the doorway. Civilian clothes, rain dripping from his jacket, a bandage wrapped around his forearm from where I'd cut him weeks ago. His eyes locked on mine, the old authority burning there as if nothing had changed. "You shouldn't be here," I said evenly, every syllable steady. "You're trespassing on a federal installation." He smiled, the kind that used to make me flinch. "I came to talk." "They can't stop a father from seeing his daughter." "I'm not your daughter," I said, "and this isn't your world anymore." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The air seemed to shrink. "You think you won?" he asked. "You embarrassed me in front of the system I built. You dragged my name through mud." He moved closer, his voice rising. "You think you're safe because of them." His finger jabbed toward the ceiling where the small red light of the security camera blinked steadily. I followed his gaze and felt something shift inside me, calm, precise. "You see that light," I said quietly. "That means they're watching. Medical inspection feeds live. Everything you say, everything you do, it's being recorded." He laughed low and broken. "You wouldn't." "Already did." For a moment, neither of us moved. The hum of the monitors filled the space between us. Then his expression changed. The arrogance cracked. "Turn it off," he said. When I didn't, he reached for the laptop on the counter. I stepped between him and the screen. His hand came up fast, gripping my arm hard enough to bruise. "You're not going to ruin me," he hissed. "Let go, Dale." He shoved me backward. My leg hit the edge of the bed, pain shooting up through bone that had only just healed. I steadied myself, breath sharp but controlled. "Security will be here any second, I warned." He lunged again, grabbing my wrist. The movement triggered something deeper than fear, an old reflex born from too many years of endurance. My hand found the nearest object on the tray beside me, a small surgical scalpel used for suture training. When he yanked me forward, I twisted the blade grazing his forearm just enough to draw a thin red line. He froze, staring at the blood spreading down his sleeve. For the first time, I saw it shock, not rage. "You cut me," he whispered. I straightened my chest, heaving. "You broke my leg," I said, voice steady. "Fair trade." The silence that followed felt endless. The rain outside hit harder, the sound like applause muffled through walls. Then the door burst open. Two MPs rushed in, Mason behind them, his expression hard. "Step away from her," he ordered. Dale turned toward the voice confusion flashing to defiance. "She attacked me!" he shouted. Mason's gaze flicked to the camera, still blinking red. "No," he said coldly. "You attacked a federal officer under surveillance." The MPs grabbed Dale's arms, pinning them behind his back. He resisted cursing, but it didn't matter. The system that once shielded him was now the witness that condemned him. As they pulled him toward the door, Dale turned, his head eyes locking on mine. "You'll regret this," he spat. I didn't look away. I already regretted staying quiet. When the door closed, the room went still except for the faint echo of boots retreating down the hall. Mason approached, his voice low. "You okay?" I nodded once. "I didn't plan for it to happen this way." He looked at the scalpel still clutched in my hand. "You didn't plan it. You survived it." I set the instrument down, staring at the thin smear of red on my glove. It wasn't triumph that filled me. It was exhaustion, like the air after lightning strikes. The camera light still blinked. I walked over and met my own reflection in the lens. For a second, I imagined everyone on the other end of that feed, the inspectors, the officers, maybe even Major Whitaker watching in silence. I spoke softly, almost to myself. "Now you've seen it. Believe it." The rain outside eased to a drizzle. Somewhere beyond the base, thunder rolled again, distant but steady, as if the world was exhaling with me. The hours after they took Dale away unfolded in fragments. Voices layered over radio chatter, fluorescent lights buzzing too loud, the faint smell of rain mixing with disinfectant. Mason guided me to the infirmary chair and crouched to eye level. "They've cleared the hallway," he said softly. "Medical command's reviewing the footage now. You're safe." I stared at the streak of blood on my sleeve, thin as a wire drying fast. "He found a way in," I murmured. "Even after everything." Mason's voice was steady. "He won't find another." Major Whitaker entered a few minutes later, her presence cutting through the static of the room. She closed the door and studied me, not as a superior officer evaluating protocol, but as someone who had seen too much of this kind of aftermath. "Lieutenant," she said gently, "sit tight. Command's requesting a full debrief." Her eyes flicked to the camera feed still active on the wall monitor. The image looped back to the moment Dale lunged, froze, rewound. "Everyone saw it," she said quietly. "Every single one of them." The word everyone landed heavier than I expected. A strange calm spread through me, the kind that comes when there's nothing left to hide. Then they know I said. They can stop wondering if it was real. Whitaker nodded. "They do. And they're not just watching anymore. They're responding." Within an hour, the small infirmary became the epicenter of something larger than my story. Military police circulated, confirming IDs, securing evidence, cataloging the scalpel and camera logs. The base commander himself arrived, his uniform still damp from the rain. "Lieutenant Pierce," he said, voice formal but measured, "I want to personally thank you for maintaining composure under duress. We've reviewed the feed. Your response was self-defense consistent with training. It should have felt like vindication, but it didn't. It felt like aftermath, the hollow echo that follows a scream." I nodded, unable to find words that fit the enormity of what had just ended. Dale was gone, but his voice still lingered somewhere inside my memory, replaying old sentences in the dark corners of my mind. "You'll regret this. You'll come crawling back." I pressed my palms against the edge of the chair until the tremor in my fingers steadied. Later, Whitaker walked me to the command briefing room. The walls were lined with screens showing paused frames from the live inspection, the moment Dale's hand clamped on my arm, the second the scalpel glinted, the instant the MPs burst in. The stills looked like someone else's life. "They're using the footage for the report," she said. "Not just for your case, but as precedent for how domestic threats infiltrate military environments." I swallowed hard. "You mean they're turning it into training material?" She nodded. "Your pain won't vanish, Lieutenant, but it will serve. Sometimes that's the closest thing we get to justice." The briefing lasted nearly 2 hours. I answered questions in the same clipped tone I used for medical evaluations, separating emotion from fact. Each statement felt like stitching a wound, painful, necessary, precise. When it ended, the commander dismissed everyone except me, Whitaker, and Mason. "I'm authorizing protective oversight for the duration of the civilian trial," he said. "Your safety remains our responsibility." Whitaker's voice softened. "He'll face charges in federal court, not military. Retired or not, assault and identity fraud don't dissolve with discharge." I exhaled slowly. Good. Let him stand under the same laws he used to preach. Mason walked me back to my quarters that evening. The rain had stopped leaving the air sharp with ozone. The barracks lights glowed faintly through mist rising from the ground. "You did it," he said finally. "It's over." I looked at the barracks door, the same one that had once been a boundary between fear and silence. "It's never really over," I said. "But maybe it's finished." Inside the room was exactly as I'd left it, except quieter. The camera above the doorway was still blinking, recording its endless watch. I sat on the bed, staring at the glow, and realized that the fear I used to feel under that light had changed shape. It wasn't surveillance anymore, it was proof. The kind that didn't disappear when people stopped believing. An hour later, my phone buzzed with a message from Major Whitaker Command approved public release of the Safe Barracks Initiative press will receive a statement in the morning. You should know they're naming you as the architect. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Architect. Not victim, not survivor. Architect. I typed back. Understood, ma'am. Thank you. That night, I barely slept. My dreams were flashes of sound. Rain shouts the snap of the American flag outside the barracks, the hum of the feed transmitting across miles of fiber. When dawn came, I walked outside barefoot, the concrete cool under my feet. The air was clean, the sky pale blue breaking through remnants of storm cloud. Soldiers marched in formation across the distant field, their cadence steady, unbroken. Mason found me there just after sunrise, 2 coffees in hand. "You made the news," he said with a crooked smile. Local station ran a headline, "Army Nurse Thwarts Ex-Instructor's Base Infiltration. They're calling you the lieutenant who fought back." I laughed once quietly. They always need a title. He handed me the coffee. "Then write your own." I took a sip, the warmth cutting through the chill. "Not hero," I said. "Not victim. Just the woman who refused to disappear." He nodded. "That works." We stood in silence for a while, watching the sunlight spill over the motor pool and turn puddles into mirrors. The bass loudspeaker crackled with the morning anthem. I raised my hand in reflexive salute, the gesture automatic grounding. The flag caught wind, snapping clean and bright. For a long moment, I thought of the night he broke my leg, the weeks I spent confined to the blade, the blood, the moment I stopped being afraid. Everything that came before felt distant now, like a story told about someone else. The pain remained, but it no longer defined the shape of my life. It had become a border one I had crossed and would never step back behind. As the anthem ended, I lowered my hand and whispered to the empty air. He saw his blood on my hands, but it wasn't revenge. It was proof I existed. The words dissolved into the morning wind carried across Fort Liberty like a final report signed not with ink, but with survival. Justice doesn't sound like the movies. It doesn't crash through doors or thunder with applause. It arrives in paperwork and pauses in courtrooms where the air tastes like dust and disinfectant. For weeks, Fort Liberty lived under the echo of what happened that day. Reporters camped outside the main gate camera crews, jostling for angles. Soldiers passing by pretended not to notice, but everyone knew. The words Lieutenant Pierce had left the base and entered public record. The civilian trial began in early spring at the Cumberland County Courthouse, the same building where I once renewed my driver's license. The irony wasn't lost on me. This time, I walked through the metal detectors in uniform, my leg-heeled posture straight. Major Whitaker sat behind me in the gallery. Mason took leave to attend a quiet constant in the row of military witnesses. Dale Riker sat across the room at the defense table. His suit pressed his face pale under the fluorescent lights. Retirement had aged him in the wrong direction. More hardness, less humanity. When the prosecutor played the footage from the inspection feed, the courtroom went silent except for the sound of rain on the video's audio track. There I was on screen, cornered and calm. His voice filled the room, those same words that used to shrink me down to size. "You think you can outsmart me?" Then came the shove, the flash of the scalpel, the blood. I could hear my own breathing echo through the speakers. The jurors shifted in their seats, some wincing, some watching with grim focus. The prosecutor paused the frame the moment his blood hit the floor. "This," she said, "is what self-defense looks like when silence fails." The defense tried to frame it differently, painting Dale as a man pushed too far by humiliation, claiming I had baited him into anger. But every time they spoke, the video stared back at them. No rhetoric could undo pixels and sound. Truth had its own rhythm, one they couldn't rewrite. When I was called to testify, my palms were dry, not trembling. The judge asked if I needed a recess before beginning. "No, Your Honor," I said. "I've waited long enough to speak under oath." The questions came like steady rain. Did he hit you before? Did he control your access to communication? Did anyone in the chain of command intervene? I answered each one clearly, fact by fact, like presenting a medical report. Emotion would have blurred the edges. Facts built the case. Still, when they asked the final question, "Why didn't you leave sooner?" something broke free from inside. "Because he made the walls look like safety," I said softly. "Because the orders said medical recovery, not captivity. Because in my world, disobedience isn't bravery, it's court-martial. I didn't want to destroy my career. I just wanted to survive it." The room stayed silent long after I finished. Even the stenographer looked up from her keyboard. 3 days later, the verdict arrived. Guilty on all counts, aggravated assault, unlawful confinement impersonating federal personnel. The judge's gavel struck once sharp and final. Dale's face twisted not in surprise but disbelief that his authority no longer held weight. They led him out in cuffs, the same hands that once slammed doors now bound by cold steel. I didn't cheer, didn't cry. I just exhaled. Sometimes closure doesn't roar, it sighs. The news spread fast. Headlines ran across national outlets. Army lieutenant exposes retired drill instructor in abuse case. My inbox flooded with messages, veterans, nurses, strangers. Some shared their own stories. Others just wrote 2 words, "Thank you." Fort Liberty held a closed press conference 1 week later. Major Whitaker stood at the podium, crisp and calm. I watched from the second row as she read the statement. "The Army does not condone silence in the face of abuse," she said. "Lieutenant Rowan Pierce's conduct under pressure will inform new protective measures across all recovery facilities under the Safe Barracks initiative." When she called my name, cameras turned like a wave. I stepped forward, uniform pressed silver bar catching light. "I didn't do this alone," I said into the microphone. "Every soldier who ever said nothing because they feared losing everything, this was for you." Flashes burst. The moment became something larger than I was ready for. But maybe that was the point. That night, I walked the base alone. The evening air smelled like cut grass and machine oil. I stopped by the old barracks, the one where it all started. The locks had been replaced, the interior refurbished. It looked almost ordinary now, like paint could be painted over if you used the right color. I touched the cool metal of the door, the memory of confinement echoing faintly through my fingers. "Not prison," I whispered. "Proof. Mason found me there leaning on the railing. You could have disappeared after the trial," he said. "No one would have blamed you." I thought about it, I admitted, but disappearing was his way of winning. He smiled. "You always did play the long game." We stood watching the sunset over the parade ground. The flag caught wind again, bright against the dimming sky. The sound of evening formation drifted from across the field, counted steps, shouted cadence, discipline reshaped into music. "It's strange," I said, "that this place held both the worst and the best moments of my life." "That's how resilience works," he said. "It doesn't replace the pain. It absorbs it." Weeks turned into months. The court-martial review for Mendez concluded quietly. Dishonorable discharge, stripped rank, pension revoked. No fanfare, no press, just an ending. Sometimes justice arrives like a whisper too. My life began to find rhythm again. I transferred to the Womack Medical Center full-time, leading the Safe Barracks program. We developed new procedures for medical confinement, mandatory third-party audits, direct communication lines for soldiers in isolation, recorded transparency for every inspection. Policy born from pain, but designed for prevention. One morning I received a letter through internal mail, no return address. Just a single line written in careful script. You saved more people than you'll ever meet. I never found out who sent it. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe gratitude like healing doesn't need a signature. When the fiscal year closed, the Army Times ran a feature. Lieutenant Rowan Pierce, the quiet reform of Fort Liberty. They used a photo from the press conference, my eyes half in shadow, half in light. The caption read, "Strength is what breaks silence." It felt strange seeing my name printed like that. My mother called after reading it. Her voice trembled through the line. "I saw the picture," she said. "He told me you slipped. I believed him. I'm sorry." For a long time I didn't answer. Then I said the only thing that felt true. "I wanted you to believe me once. Now, I just want you to live without him." We didn't say much after that, but something softer moved between us, fragile, tentative, real. Maybe forgiveness doesn't arrive all at once. Maybe it's just the decision to stop carrying someone else's guilt. By summer, the base felt alive again. New recruits trained on the same grounds where I once limped alone. My limp was nearly gone, though sometimes in rain it whispered back through my bones. On my desk sat the commendation Whitaker insisted I accept framed but unsigned. I didn't need her signature to remember what it meant. On my last evening before reassignment, I stood outside watching the sky turn violet over the airfield. The wind carried the faint hum of a distant convoy and the flutter of flags along the parade line. The world had gone on. And somehow so had I. I whispered into the wind, not for him, not for them, but for myself. I didn't fight to destroy him. I fought to reclaim me. The breeze caught my voice and carried it away across the base, dissolving into the open Carolina dusk, a sound small enough to vanish but strong enough to outlast the silence that once defined me. 6 months passed, and with each one the bass grew quieter inside my mind. The noise of crisis faded, replaced by the slow rhythm of ordinary duty morning drills, coffee too hot, the rustle of paperwork that didn't involve my name. Peace, I learned, isn't a single event. It's a series of choices you make when no one's watching. Every day I chose to stay, to rebuild, to be more than what happened. By autumn, the Safe Barracks initiative had taken root across other installations. Commanders began calling for consultation sessions, asking for training materials, procedural updates, or simply for guidance on how to prevent another Fort Liberty incident. My name became shorthand for reform, but I kept it small-grounded. I preferred the word reminder. Not hero, not whistleblower, just proof that one voice documented and steady could ripple through a rigid system. I spent long hours in the administrative wing overseeing reports from other bases, each detailing their new transparency measures. Some nights I stayed late walking the halls when the lights dimmed and the building echoed like a cathedral. There was comfort in that quiet. It no longer felt like isolation. It felt like ownership. Mason had been reassigned to the same program as logistics liaison. He'd stop by my office with his usual coffee and dry humor. "You ever realize we became paperwork instead of adrenaline?" he joked one morning. I smiled, setting aside a file. "Paperwork saves lives," I said. "Adrenaline only complicates them." He leaned on the doorframe, watching me with that quiet steadiness that had carried me through darker days. "You're different now," he said, calmer. I looked up from the desk. "Calm isn't weakness, Mason. It's when the fire finally burns clean." He nodded. "Then I'd say you're finally home." Outside, autumn light scattered gold through the trees that lined the medical center's courtyard. I walked there during lunch breaks, the scent of pine and cold air grounding me. Soldiers passed nodding respectfully, but not pitying. That was new. Respect without fragility. I'd earned that the hard way. One afternoon, an email came from headquarters pending promotion review. First Lieutenant Rowan Pierce recommended for Staff Captain Safe Barracks Division Lead. The message ended with 3 words that pulled at my chest, subject to approval. I read them twice, then closed the laptop and leaned back. It wasn't the rank that mattered. It was what it represented survival that transformed into leadership. That night, I returned to my quarters and opened the small wooden box I'd kept on my shelf since my early days at Fort Sam Houston. Inside were fragments of the past, a photo of my father in uniform, a pressed clover from basic training, and the last unopened letter from my mother. I'd kept it sealed through everything, afraid of what it might contain, apology or denial, both dangerous in their own way. I finally opened it. Rowan, it began. I don't know how to make up for the years I didn't protect you. I believed comfort over truth, and I let fear decide for both of us. You were never too strong for me. You were just stronger than the lies I needed to believe. I'm trying to be better. I hope you'll let me try again. The words blurred, but not from pain, from release. I folded the letter back carefully, placed it under the photo of my father, and whispered, I already did. In the weeks that followed, I started hosting small sessions with new recruits. Quiet gatherings where I talked about resilience not as a slogan, but as survival. Strength. I told them isn't about never breaking. It's about choosing what to rebuild with after you do. Some of them cried, some just listened, but all of them stayed until the end. When the promotion came through officially, Major Whitaker handed me the document herself. Captain Pierce, she said with a rare smile, you've turned pain into policy. Not everyone can do that. I shook her hand firmly. Policy saves lives, ma'am. That's all I wanted. She hesitated, then added, You know the new trainees talk about you like a legend, the woman who recorded the system from the inside. I laughed softly. Tell them legends are overrated. I'm just a nurse who refused to follow bad orders. Later that evening, after the small ceremony ended, I walked alone toward the parade ground. The sun dipped low, casting the flagpole's shadow long across the field. I stopped at the same spot where the worst memory used to live the moment he said you should thank me, and stood in silence. The wind lifted my hair cool and steady. I raised my hand in salute, not for rank, not for country, but for the part of myself that survived without applause. Sometimes healing isn't loud. It's the quiet decision to stay where you once swore you'd never stand again. As twilight deepened, Mason joined me, hands in his pockets. You ever think you'd make it here? He asked. I looked around the field, the barracks, the open sky. Not in the same skin, I said, but maybe in the same soul. He smiled. You're poetic when you're exhausted. Occupational hazard, I replied. We stood there watching the flag lower for the evening, the colors folding into disciplined precision. It struck me then how every ritual here, every salute, every step was about control, but also about belonging. The difference was who held the power to choose it. I wasn't under orders anymore. I was part of the system that had once confined me, reshaped from within. When the ceremony ended, I turned to Mason. Dinner's on me tonight, I said, for old time's sake. He grinned. I'll hold you to that, Captain. As we walked toward the mess hall, the barracks lights flickered on behind us, warm against the darkening sky. Each window glowed like a heartbeat, small but steady. For the first time, those walls didn't represent confinement, they represented endurance. I thought of the younger soldiers still learning what strength meant, the ones who'd grow up in a military safer because of a few recorded seconds, and a nurse who wouldn't stay quiet. I thought of my mother rebuilding somewhere in Tennessee, learning to breathe again. And I thought of myself not the version defined by trauma, but the one who had outlived it, shaped it, and turned it into purpose. As the mess hall doors opened, the hum of laughter and conversation wrapped around me, ordinary and beautiful. I paused, breathing it in. The world didn't need to know every scar to see the value of what remained. Strength wasn't in surviving alone. It was in coming back steady, unafraid, and still capable of gentleness. That night, as I lay in bed, the faint sound of distant training echoed through the base. Boots, striking dirt commands, shouted in rhythm, the heartbeat of discipline and resilience intertwined. I smiled to the dark, whispering the words that had become my quiet vow. Family isn't who keeps you silent. It's who helps you stand when you finally speak. And somewhere beyond the barracks walls, under the same Carolina sky, peace finally answered back. The camera fades in on the quiet barracks corridor, empty, lit only by a single fluorescent tube humming faintly overhead. My voice begins slowly steady but heavy with memory. When I first arrived at Fort Liberty, I thought discipline was safety. I thought silence meant strength. I followed every order, smiled through every bruise, and told myself endurance was loyalty. But silence isn't loyalty. It's surrender. The frame shifts to the window overlooking the parade ground at dawn. Soldiers march in formation below their boots, striking rhythmically against wet asphalt. I continue, voice calm, reflective. I used to believe healing meant erasing what happened. Now I know healing is remembering it without flinching. The people who hurt you don't get to write the last chapter of your story. You do. A soft piano note fades in underneath, barely perceptible. The screen shows my hands straightening the folded uniform on the bed, the same one I once wore during confinement. The camera lingers on the faint crease lines, the reflection of light off the insignia. People still ask if I regret what I did that night. If I could go back, would I do it differently? The truth is, I wouldn't change a thing. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Some truths need to bleed to be believed. The shot cuts to the American flag outside the window, caught in a slow gust. My voice drops lower. I didn't win because the system believed me. I won because I believed myself first, and that's something no trial, no verdict, no title can take away. The camera follows as I step outside into the courtyard. Evening light glows against the wet pavement, everything bathed in quiet gold. I pause beside the bench where I used to sit during physical therapy, the place where pain became routine, then progress, then memory. Family isn't who shares your blood, it's who lets you breathe. The ones who listen when the rest of the world calls you too much, too broken, too loud. Real family gives you space to rebuild without fear of punishment for standing tall. The music swells slightly. The camera pans upward toward the sky clouds, thinning pale sunlight breaking through. If you've ever been told to keep quiet for your own good, if you've ever been trapped by someone who said it was love, I need you to hear this. You don't owe silence to anyone. A pause long enough to breathe. Your story matters even when it shakes the walls around you, especially then. The camera focuses back on my face, older, steadier, lit by fading daylight. The corners of my mouth lift not in triumph, but in peace. The blood on my hands that night wasn't vengeance. It was proof that I existed, proof that I refused to disappear into someone else's version of control. And if that makes me difficult, defiant, or dangerous, then so be it. I'd rather be all three than be silent again. A soft wind moves across the courtyard, carrying the sound of flag rope tapping against metal. I look up once more, eyes reflecting the movement of light. Strength isn't the armor that hides the wound. It's the choice to keep moving with the scar visible. The piano fades to a single lingering note. My voice lowers into something almost like a whisper. If this story found you when you needed to hear it, if it reminded you that standing your ground isn't cruelty but survival, tell me where you're watching from. You never know who might need to see your courage next. The frame holds on my salute, simple, clean, motionless. The flag behind me ripples once more before the screen fades to black. White text appears slowly against silence. You don't owe silence to anyone. Fade out.